Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hi everyone, Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist podcast. It's wonderful to have you here this week, and my guest is Tony Liu. Tony and his partner Chu are the founders of Berwick Dental Studio in Melbourne, and this particular practice has been in hypergrowth since they formed it 2.5 years ago. And of course, with hypergrowth comes lots of opportunities as well as lots of challenges. And so our conversation today is really, it's a bit more of an interrogation in a sense. We're putting Tony in the hot seat. We're putting the interrogation light on him, and we're asking him to spill his guts and to spill the beans on how he's been able to achieve such growth in the first place, but also how he's been able to manage that growth and to take advantage of the opportunities that have come his way. It's a wide-ranging interview, and Tony's really generous with his knowledge, and he shares openly, he shares freely, and there's a ton of lessons in here for those people who are contemplating practice ownership, those who are driving hard in their practice, and those who are experiencing phenomenal growth like Tony has. And even in today's economic climate, even in a competitive landscape, Tony and Chu are really doing very well. And so there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of pearls in this particular episode that are practical and useful, and I know that you can apply in your practice for great effect too. So I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I've enjoyed recording it. Here's Dr. Tony Liu. Tony Liu, thank you so much for taking the time out of your practice to come and hang with us on the Savvy Dentist podcast. How are you today, my friend?
Very, very good. Pretty happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, mate, it's an absolute treat. It's a pleasure. Now, mate, obviously I've known you for a while now, and you run a fantastic practice in Melbourne, Berwick Dental Studio, and it's a practice that's gone through hypergrowth. It's a practice that is doing extraordinarily well in a fairly busy market. And what I wanted to talk about today is, some of the things you've learned in that journey, some of the things you've done well, and so on and so forth. But before we get to the meat and potatoes of that, I'm wondering if you could give our listeners a bit of a sense of, your journey to this point, or your journey up to practice ownership. What were you like? What were you interested in? How did you find your way into this part?
I think personally, I've always been this person that really wanted to do things my way. I'm one of those stubborn people. I think a lot of dentists might relate, but one of those stubborn people that always wanted things my way. And I've realized that no matter where I went, I've always found that people had things their way, and it's not really my way. So eventually I've come to the realization that if things has to be my way, I have to own it. And so going forwards, what I've done is I've gone and found out some of the most well-run clinics that I can find, got myself in there, worked, seen how things are actually worked, because I didn't really just dive straight into the deep end, learned a bit, and then here we are.
Fantastic. And when you've looked at those practices that you've observed, what were some of the key things that you modeled from those in your own practice? What lessons did you learn from those early mentors?
I'd say probably organization's a massive one. Having great teamwork, team that sticks around with you, massive bonus. And of course, you always have to watch your numbers. Massive one.
Yeah, nice. So, mate, your practice is, I think, quite a phenomenal practice on lots of different levels. But one of the things that I've observed about you and Chu is you've been able to create a practice that has really grown very, very rapidly in a market that some would say is saturated, in a market that some would say is uber competitive. And I'm curious, does that growth surprise you at all, or did you always know that there was that opportunity there for you?
Personally, I would say the opportunity is always there.
Yep.
I'm in a moderately competitive environment. The thing is, I've seen lots of people open up in extremely competitive environments and still do extremely well. So wasn't too surprised that we did good here.
Yeah. I'm not surprised given your nature as well, because I know you're a fairly driven kind of dude. So what was it that allowed you to thrive in that environment?
I think it's to identify what isn't available, because if you're doing exactly what everyone else is doing in that area, well, you're going to be the same. So if you want to be different, you really have to figure out why and how you're different, and whether that difference actually makes a difference to who you're trying to serve, who you seek to serve.
Okay, I really like that, mate. There's some things I'd like to unpick there. And it's the difference that makes the difference. I get that.
Yep.
And so obviously that'll differ from one market to the next. I totally understand that. If you were, obviously not looking at your market necessarily, but just broadly, where do you see dentists across the board falling into the trap of being the same as everyone else?
I'd say really be critical with how you think you're different, because most dentists out there, if you ask them how they're different, they'd be able to list a whole bunch of stuff, but then every single other dentist down the road lists the same things. So that makes people not so unique.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I've observed, Tony, and you might have heard this as well, is when you ask a dentist how you're different, they'll either say, we're just like them but better, or my crown margins are just that little bit better than the person down the road, which of course means nothing to the patient. They can't determine that, right? And the worst one, of course, is, I'm just like them, but cheaper. I can do as good a job, but cheaper. And of course, that creates a race to the bottom, and it creates price-sensitive dentistry and so on and so forth. So my question for you is, we understand that it's the difference that makes the difference. Did you know that up front, or did you have to test and measure and iterate a few times to find that?
I think initially we fell into the exact same trap as a lot of other people, not saying everyone, a lot of other people out there. We thought we were doing things quite significantly different. Turns out, not really. And it was a lot of trial and error to figure out exactly what it was the customers really, really liked from us, and to really just amplify those areas.
Okay. And did you ask your customers what they were looking for? Did you go through a survey process and understanding what your market was looking for?
Absolutely. I mean, initially what we did was we surveyed every single patient that came through. So every time anybody new came through, we'd send them a survey with a set of questions asking exactly what I wanted to know. But eventually we realized that, hey, not all patients are created equal. And there are some that we loved a little bit more, and some perhaps not so much so. So I think we had to tune our strategy a little bit there, just to focus more on who we really could see every single day.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I really resonate with that. Patients are lovely. I'm not judging them as people, but in terms of fit for our practice or fit for your practice, there's some that you find that there's just a greater, I don't know, hand in glove feels a bit better than for other people, I guess. It just feels like a better fit.
Goldilocks moment, I think.
I think so, mate. Exactly right. So, okay. So how's your practice changed then? As you've gone through that process, what changes have you seen? What have you learned? What have been the key things that you've learned in that journey about yourself or about business?
I'd say having that very, very specific market that we serve and zoning in on that constantly over time. And I don't feel like we're there yet, but we're getting closer. And zoning in on exactly who we seek to serve really helped create an environment where the whole process of patients finding us, coming in, that process will filter out a lot of the people who we actually didn't really like.
Yeah.
And all the people who eventually make it through the door tends to be the ones where teams enjoy seeing. They're super grateful for having seen us. And price really is a thing that rarely comes into play in their minds. And even if it does, they'd save up. They won't go anywhere else. They'd still want to come here, which is a really great thing that we managed to create, I feel.
And I know your practice, and I know the numbers, and I know you're really, really busy. And one of the things that, we talk about off air is, managing that growth, because growth is great, but growth also brings with it some challenges. Whether it's stresses on the system, stresses on the team. What are the things that you found stressful about growth?
That's actually a great question, because when we first started, what we know now is definitely not what we knew then. So one of the key metrics that I always go for when we first started is the raw number of new patients that we came through the door every single month. And if it was higher than last month, that was a great month. But what we eventually realized was that having a ton of new patients actually means we weren't doing enough work, and we had tons of space to fit these new patients into. So ultimately, more new patient is better, but for the same number of chairs, a balance is actually healthier. So that was one of the big things. Another really major thing that we found was that growing too quickly, we could never, ever keep up with the number of staff members that we have. And that's created a whole host of problems.
Yeah, but I know you've worked through those problems as well because, again, there's been some adaptation and some changes. So when you start out with a practice, and yours was a startup, you bring on that first person, that team member, then you bring on the next one and the next one. Did you find that everyone was a great culture fit up front, or did you have to kind of really go back and rework your culture?
What we actually realized recently, and looking back, totally true, is that a lot of the staff members that we had initially were a culture fit for our practice at that stage. But as we moved on, some of these ones, we realized there wasn't really a great fit anymore. So they got us here, but they won't be able to get us to the next step, I guess, next stage. And as a result, we have lost a few members who are no longer a culture fit for what we're trying to do here.
Okay, so as the practices evolve, the cultures evolve, therefore the fit of the people on the team, changes over time. And again, it's not a matter of whether those people are good or bad people. It's just really a matter of fit. And again, looking to go to the next level. Tony, let's talk a little bit about the growth challenge a bit further, because again, I think there's some things in there, because there'll be people listening to this kind of going, what do you mean challenges with growth? Give me that challenge. I'd happily have that challenge. And if you're not yet, if you're listening to this podcast and you're not yet at that challenge, I promise you will get to that challenge. And hopefully, what Tony's sharing here is going to give you a little bit of forewarning so you can anticipate this and prepare for it and then deal with it. Because I can tell you in our own practice, there were mistakes that we made too, and I'm sure all of us make our mistakes. And the question I really want to ask you around honing in on that growth and managing that, and we've spoken a bit about team, we've spoken a little bit about culture. What about your hours? How did that go? I know you've been pretty diligent in trying to keep your hours in check, but was it always that way, or did it ever get out of hand? Did you ever find yourself working late nights and trying to fit in an extra patient late in the afternoon for the revenue, and then kind of get home knackered, trying to fit dinner in and fall asleep in front of the telly kind of routine?
What you're describing is exactly what my basically first entire year was like. I just started up a new practice, massive amount of loan, not much money in the bank, and you're like, all right, I'm going to make every dollar count, going to make every hour, every day. And we've often found ourselves still at the clinic, just tinkering with things, trying to make things just a marginal bit better. We've often found ourselves at clinic still at 12 a.m., 1 a.m., and then 40-minute drive home, and then dinner time, right?
Yeah.
Next day, rinse and repeat. And initially, it was just me and my partner, Chu. So I've been doing good 10 hours of clinical work a day and then non-clinical work after that. Now, sort of 2.5 years in, I've managed to work myself down to 1.5 clinical days. And the rest of the time, I've really trying to hone in on exactly what it is that drives my business forward, rather than doing every single bit and trying to perfect every single little detail that may or may not actually move the needle.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about that process, that transition period, because you went from working like a crazy man to getting a whole lot more balance in your life. What was the first thing you did to create a bit more of that balance and to start that process? Because, of course, you don't kind of go from working crazy hours like you were doing to what you're currently doing overnight. There's a transition and a process. So can you describe that transition and process for us? Because, again, there's lots of people listening to this who might be sitting there going, oh my God, Tony, I'm working 90 hours a week. I'm eating my dinner and on my bracket table at night. Hopefully not people, but just in case. In essence, they're working really, really hard. So what was that transition like for you? How did it start? What was the first, second, third, and fourth things that you did to really move that along?
I think pure accumulation of experience does it a little bit, but what's really sped it up for me was to keep the vision, the end goal in sight. Because personally for myself, and a lot of people could have different goals, but my goal was to have 0 clinic days. And so in order to do that, I really needed to see what tasks am I doing with my day that's not really helping. Who can do it? How can I make it automatic? Who do I need to help me with it to move it along? Because I think it's a mindset shift from me being able to do the best in every single task to, hey, someone else can do it just as well as me and free me up for more important things.
Okay, so that was step one. So identified the things that you're doing throughout the day. You looked at, making a bit of an itinerary of how you spent your time, categorizing those tasks as whether they were essential or unessential for you to be doing. And then obviously you delegated or you automated or so on and so forth. And you freed up a bit of time that way. But that's still a big jump to go from there to a day and a half. So you would have then started thinking about bringing on associates and creating some leverage. Was that the next step?
Yeah. So I'd say one of the biggest things I always ask myself these days is what leverages can I find in my day, in my tasks, and what frees up my time? So how can I multiply the effectiveness of my time? One, I guess, good example was when I first started bringing on associates. I'd be with them after work every day, going through cases, taking hours doing that. My associates would burn out because they've just had a long day, go through a few cases, write their notes. By the time they get home, boom, super late. And of course, I'd be home late along with them. And we really can see the burnout in our associates. These days, our new system has come. Like one of the new improvements we managed to make was actually to get all our associates in one place, one time, once a week, go through all the cases. I only have to say it once, and 3-4 people would benefit in a row. And of course, they'd be able to share their own cases and build up their own confidence in each other.
Yeah, nice. So it's a bit of a group learning, group coaching kind of arrangement. So
that's it.
Yeah,
trying to make one unit of time worth, 3 people, 4 people's hours.
Yeah. So, mate, with the associates and bringing them on, were there any headaches with that, or did it all just kind of go pretty easily? Did you have any challenges, bringing on an associate? Because remember, this is, your first run at running a dental practice. And so if you nailed it out of the box, I think there'll be a lot of people kind of cursing you right now, going, oh my God, how did that work? But you have nailed it now. But I'm curious to understand, did you nail it out of the box, or were there some stuff-ups?
Oh, look, I'd be lying if I said I nailed it out of the box. It'd be a pretty rare time. Maybe my first hire, she's still with me. So maybe at that point I nailed it out of the box.
Yeah, that's good.
As we started bringing more and more people on, there are definitely times where we've hired people that we didn't really enjoy being around with. That wasn't a great fit for what we had.
Okay.
And some people, they showed it quicker than others.
Okay. So why is it, or how is it that you're able to refine that process to be clearer about who you felt was going to be a good fit? And you said some people showed it faster than others, but specifically, what were you looking for? Was it competence? Was it culture fit? Was it a combination of the two? What sort of things were you looking at? How did you assess them? What was that process?
Well, what we did was we initially came up with a list of qualities that we must have, and then a whole bunch of nice to haves, and then a whole bunch of basically absolute nots. And each candidate that came through basically popped them through that little filter there. If they had too many or even one of the absolute nots, then we wouldn't go forward. So that's through the interviewing, the sort of recruitment process. And if they have lots of the ones that we really, really want, fantastic. We used to filter a lot harder than we do now. So what we ended up with was we had like hundreds of applications. We'll get it down to 1 or 2. What we realized was wrong with that that method, though, was that it really didn't give some people a chance. So if they weren't great straight off the bat, some of them, the good people, got filtered out for no reason. And so we said, hey, look, we included a practical component to our interviews now where they do actually come in for a little bit just to see if the whole team, not just myself, likes them.
Okay, awesome. Okay. When you've gone through this growth period, and we spoke about some of the strains coming around the team, burning out the associates, potentially burning out yourselves, and we spoke about, freeing your time up, what else have you done to create that leverage in your practice? Because you've spoken about, I think, a really important topic, and that's the multiplier effect, or how can you maximize the effectiveness of a unit of time? What other things have you done to maximize time or to create other leverage points in your practice?
I think having a practice manager or someone in a more leading role, and of course promoting your own associate dentists to a leading role really helps, because then it creates additional roles where not everybody will come to you for the answers. You don't want to be the answers guy. You want other answers people out there in your practice where you can teach them one thing and they can teach a whole bunch of other people one thing. So that really helps. another thing that I really love doing is creating systems and scripts, having them recorded or written somewhere that everybody can access. So if anybody ever really asks me for something that has already been written, all I do is point them in the right direction, and I won't have to go through that process with them.
Okay. So, mate, there'll be some people listening to this podcast going, Tony, I'm looking at starting a practice. I'm looking at, getting my feet wet in that regard. If you could whisper in their ear one or two or three, whisper sweet nothings. If you could whisper maybe some advice rather than sweet nothings in their ear, what are the couple of key things that you would say to someone who's just thinking about starting out in that regard?
I'd say the biggest thing is make sure you really know you want it. And if you do, go for it. But before you're going for it, though, do your research, because too many people haven't done enough research before jumping in. Don't research forever. Don't have paralysis by analysis, but also don't go in blind. That's probably the biggest one. And the other one is, of course, that grass isn't always greener on the other side. So if you're an associate, you're looking at your boss going, they're earning the big bucks. It's not always like that.
Yeah, I remember someone described this, Tony, and I can't even remember who said it. So, please forgive the misattribution if this is you who quoted me somewhere. I don't know who said it, but I remember someone saying to me, Jesse, for a while I used to look at my boss and think, what a dickhead. And now I realize I've become him, and people look at me like that as well. And so you're absolutely right. The grass is not always greener on the other side. And I think, if you're an associate and you're happy being an associate, there's nothing wrong with that career. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. But equally, if you're like Tony or like me, and you think, there's a certain way I want to do things, and the only way that you can get what you want is to own a practice, then maybe practice ownership is for you. And that's something worth investigating. And as Tony said, doing the research. One of the things that, we talk about, and Tony, you would have heard me say this 100 times, is that evidence-based business rather than, just gut feel. Because we talk about evidence-based dentistry all the time, and we research, our composite resonance to the nth degree. And if we applied the same degree of rigor to our business research, we'd all be better for it. So I want to ask you, mate, what surprises you these days when you look at the market, when you look at the profession? Is there anything that surprises you particularly, or do you just kind of take it as it comes? But I'm curious to ask that question because it gives the listener a bit of an insight into how your mind works, and it also gives people a bit of an insight into where you might see the future being.
I'm actually quite surprised that the level of spending at the moment, with COVID still going pretty strong, especially in Victoria where I am, the spending is actually very, very high. So that's totally not what I was expecting.
That's the consumer spending, you mean?
Consumer spending.
Yeah.
I'd say that with the way the economy is, people ought to be a bit more careful and have a bit of cash reserves. But no, everyone's just out, just totally splashing it like crazy. I mean, it's great for me, but it's a bit worrying in the sort of short, medium term.
Yeah.
But I guess the good thing is that I would say, having just come out of the worst of COVID, there's opportunities for things everywhere. You just got to know where to look.
Yeah. Amen to that, brother. Amen to that. I think, when it comes to every kind of upheaval, there's always opportunities that come out of upheaval. And the GFC was a great one as well. There's opportunity that came out of that. And of course, not diminishing anything that's coming out of COVID or the economic effects of COVID, but the headlines. I did an exercise the other day, actually. I don't know if I showed you this, but I was looking at all the newspaper headlines over the last period of time. And some of the headlines from the 1920s depression, the dot-com boom and bust, the GFC, and more recently the COVID situation. The headlines were exactly the same. The newspaper headlines could have been written almost word for word, and the worst thing since was generally it. And again, I'm with you. I think there's opportunities that come out of that every single time.
I mean, absolutely. I'm a huge reader of financial reviews. I've done a bit of studying on I didn't live through a lot of these things, and I wasn't a business owner through some of them either. But having seen a lot of these news headings and these top economists' predictions, it's like the end of the world every 10 years or every 5 years, if that.
Yep.
And really, it never really ends. And on the other side, there's lots of strong businesses that's just sprouted out of out of these situations where people have managed to take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, and of course, in order to be strong, you've got to position yourself to capitalize on those opportunities. So cash flow and having cash reserves and all of those, really sound financial measures that, aren't sexy, but it's so important. It's not as sexy as, the shiny, bright object, that we're looking at, but, those fundamentals make a huge difference. Just one last question for you, Matt, as we go through this.
Hello.
As we go thinking about your next step of growth, and, what's the next challenge you're going to have to solve in your practice, do you reckon?
I think the next main challenge is definitely to replace myself completely clinically. I find lots of practice owners, they also happen to be the number one best clinician, top producer, knows way more procedures, converts much better than any of their associates. And for my personal goal of having 0 clinical days, I'd have to replace my functions completely. So that'll be a pretty huge step, but when I get there, I'd be pretty happy.
And are there any obstacles that you can think of in accomplishing that?
I'll need to make sure my team's up to the being able to replace me just from a clinical perspective. And in terms of the rest of it, I'm fairly confident I'll be able to systemize it to take a lot of that onus out of the individual and move it onto the system.
What about capacity? Is that something you're thinking about as you go through?
For sure. But I guess the thing is, I don't want to increase capacity too much at this stage. Growth is nice, and I've realized growth is nice. But what I've also realized is that when you have a ton of problems and you keep growing and growing and growing, that problem multiplies as well and really wreaks havoc.
It sure does. You can scale complexity very, very easily.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, mate, I just want to say thanks, mate, because, what we've really done today is to put you in the hot seat, to put you under the heat lamp and really try and pry some answers out of you, because you have done very well, Tony. You and Chu have done remarkably well. And I think, firstly, kudos to you both for running an exceptionally good practice, one that is flying. And, in spite of the fact of the complexity thing we just spoke about, you have gone through a period of hypergrowth, and you've been able to manage that growth, while remaining sane and not letting the wheels fall off the wagon. I see a lot of practices where growth can actually kill the business because it just becomes too much too soon, and the structures and the infrastructure is just not there. And what I really admire about you and Chu is you've built the scalable infrastructure. You've built the assets. You've worked really hard to create a self-managing team. You've been able to be strategic in your decision-making rather than just reactive or tactical every minute of every day. And you've been able to execute at a high level and employ higher order thinking to do that. So, mate, really well done. I think you've been a real success in that regard. And so firstly, I want to say good job. Secondly, I want to say thanks so much for allowing us a bit of a peek inside the life and times of Tony Lu so that we can get a bit of an understanding of how other people might take inspiration from that and be able to replicate that for themselves. So, mate, once again, you're a champ. Appreciate it. And looking forward to catching up for a beer when you Victorians stop having coronavirus.
That's it. We're going to get our acts together a bit better and... And hopefully that all comes under control, and really look forward to getting back together again just in person. Yeah,
looking forward to it too, mate. But thanks once again. You're an absolute trooper. And again, really appreciate your time today, mate.
All good.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green. For more free tools and resources, join the free Facebook group. Visit drjessegreen.com/Facebook. And for more episodes, visit drjessegreen.com/savvydentist.